orders of the day, government orders, government bills. Resuming debate at third reading stage of Bill C-20, Canada-Honduras Economic Growth and Prosperity Act.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to say it's a pleasure to stand up and speak about this subject, but given the horrific record that I'm about to share, a record of facts in this House, I can't say that's the case. I've heard some members of the Conservatives catcall across that, why don't we like Honduras? Mr. Speaker, this has nothing to do with that. What this has to do with, what I would ask the government is, why does this government not like democracy? Why does this government not like human rights? Why does this government not like freedom of the press? Why does this government not like keeping a society free of drugs? And I'll go on forth. Honduras is a country, Mr. Speaker, that had a military coup in 2009 where the military removed a democratically elected government at gunpoint in 2009 and replaced it with a government that had no democratic mandate. Honduras is a place that has widespread human rights abuses. It's a place that has massive corruption, and that corruption is both governmental and police. There is no functioning court system in Honduras. It is a narco-trafficking center. It is considered by the U.S. State Department to be one of the most violent places on earth. It is the murder capital of the world. It is the most dangerous place on earth for journalists, where Honduras represses the media to such an extent that PEN International has ranked it below Ukraine under Yanukovych and below Egypt today. It is the cocaine trafficking center of Central America, where the U.S. State Department estimates that 79% of all cocaine shipments emanating from South America land in Honduras. It is one of the poorest nations in the Western Hemisphere. It has no strategic value for Canada, where the net total of all exports that Canada made to Honduras last year was $38 million. It's got extremely low environmental standards, if they exist at all. It has extremely low labor standards, where some 40% of the population of Honduras makes under the minimum wage of Honduras. And it has serious mining issues. Now, it's very interesting that both the Conservatives and Liberals have joined together to support this bill. Now, they support this bill at second reading, and what's interesting is that we heard witnesses at committee that buttressed every single thing I just said, and there was no contradiction by a single witness that came before committee. In other words, Honduras is one of the most repressive, undemocratic, corrupt, dangerous places on earth, and this government wants to extend preferential trade relations to that government, and the Liberals want to assist them. Now, the government, I understand why they would do that. What I'm having a little bit more difficulty, given the propaganda and rhetoric coming from the Liberal Party, is why they are. The honourable member from Scarborough-Guildwood, who I think is in the House tonight, has been championing a bill that is supposed to raise the standards of Canadian mining companies around the world. And the Liberal Party uses that to say that, they're concerned about mining standards, and they want mining standards in third world countries and second world countries to be raised, where environmental standards and the rights of Indigenous people and corporate social responsibility standards are raised. And yet the Liberal Party then turns around and supports a bill, a trade bill, with Honduras that has probably the most lax mining standards on the planet. I don't understand that. I've heard the Liberal Party talk about human rights. They appear to be concerned about human rights. I'll say it for the Canadian public, and will defend it to anybody who wants to look at the record and the facts. Honduras is one of the worst human rights violators on the planet. And I'll go through the figures. Let's just go through some of the numbers, and I'll tell you why I say these. Honduras is ranked 85th out of 167 on the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, and that's a slide from 74th in 2008. Honduras is classified as a hybrid regime rather than its previous designation as a flawed democracy. It's getting worse. So much for rewarding a country for getting better. Mr. Speaker, this government is continuing to negotiate and signing a trade agreement and giving preferential economic terms to a country that's actually sliding away from democracy. Transparency International ranks Honduras as the most corrupt country in Central America and notes it has the worst income inequality in the region. I've commented about the U.S. State Department estimating about the cocaine shipments originating in South America landing in Honduras. Drugs move from South America through countries like Honduras and other Central American states into Mexico, the United States, and into Canada. Independent observers have noted the increasing levels of violence as well as organized criminal and gang activity associated with trade in illegal narcotics. Now, for a country that's awash in drugs and drug money, it raises the question why any Canadian government would want to liberalize investment rules to make the flow of capital easier between the two countries. In other words, we're going to have more drug money come into Canada because of this trade deal with Honduras. According to The Economist, the countries in the northern triangle of Central American Isthmus, that includes Honduras, form what is, quote, now the most violent region on earth. Now stop for a moment, Mr. Speaker, and think about that. Think of the places there. We have Syria. We have the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've got Rwanda. We have Uganda. There's places on earth right now where the most horrific crimes against humanity are being committed. And Honduras is the most violent place on earth. And this government, Conservatives, want Canadians to extend preferential trade terms to that government. In 2012, Honduras became the murder capital of the world, reaching a record high of 7,172 homicides in 2012, or 81 per 100,000 people. Since the 2009 coup d'etat, violence and repression in the country have gone up and reached an all-time high. Now, put that in context. Honduras has about 1/5 the population of Canada. That would be the equivalent of Canada experiencing 35,000 homicides. Can you imagine this country if we had 35,000 homicides? That's the equivalent per capita homicide rate in this country. Again, this is the country Conservatives want us to be trading more with. In 2013, just last year, lest anybody think that this is an old problem, there were on average 10 massacres per month. Now, a massacre is defined as an instance where 3 or more people were murdered at one time. Now, in the previous 4 years, less than 20% of all homicides in Honduras were even investigated, let alone prosecuted. Now, again, we hear a lot of talk by this government about rule of law. Rule of law means you've got an independent police force, you've got an independent judiciary. I've heard this government for 6 years talk about getting tough on crime, and they have signed a trade agreement with a country that doesn't even investigate murders. The most murderous country on earth, the police don't investigate, and the judges don't even hear the cases. And this government thinks we should be trading more with this government. Is that tough on crime? That's absurd. I want to talk about journalists, because I think journalists in Canada should be writing about this. Freedom of the press and having an independent media is part of being a democracy. Today, journalists in Honduras suffer threats, attacks, and killings. 6 months ago, TV news anchor Annabel Barrow was abducted while driving in Honduras, and his dismembered remains were found weeks later. When several suspects have been charged as kidnapping, none have even been brought to trial. 35 journalists have been murdered in Honduras over the last 5 years. Again, to put that in perspective, if you put that in per capita terms, that's over 150 journalists in Canada killed over the last 5 years. Can you imagine if in this country we had 150 journalists who were doing their job, holding the government to account, doing investigative work, covering politics, covering the activities of the corporate sector, were being murdered, and we were finding their bodies in ditches? That's what's happening in Honduras. Mr. Speaker, this is not rhetoric. These are the facts in Honduras, backed up by every source there is. At committee, we called witness after witness after witness to testify to this, and there was not a single rebuttal to this. All we heard was silence, as the Conservatives and Liberals turn a blind eye to this. Now, Canadians want trade. We want to be trading with countries, but Canadians don't want us trading with butcherous, murderous regimes. That's why Canadians wouldn't accept a trade agreement with Yanukovych, Ukraine, which I noticed a Liberal trade critic stands up and waxes in this House about how offended she was by the human rights situation in Ukraine and how we have to stand up for human rights in Ukraine. That's the same Liberal trade critic who stands up and says we should support a trade agreement with Honduras, which I will tell you right now has a far worse record on human rights than Ukraine even did under Yanukovych. This is inexplicable, Mr. Speaker. In June 2013, 24 U.S. senators signed a letter expressing concern about human rights situation in Honduras. 94 members of Congress have called on the U.S. State Department to halt all military aid to Honduras in light of its violent repression of political activity. Conservatives are signing a trade agreement with a country that has violent repression of political activity. Now, Mr. Speaker, I could go on about the violence against Indigenous people, the violence against the LGBT community, but instead I'm going to read you some of the quotes that we heard at committee that the Liberals and Conservatives just want to pass over. This is Ms. Karen Spring from Honduras Solidarity Network. She says, since 2009, the violence in Honduras has increased dramatically, and coupled with a high impunity rate, this has been very troubling for the human rights situation in the country. Very few crimes are investigated, and even fewer are brought before a judge. The Honduran Supreme Court has estimated that the impunity rate is 98%. But depending on who you ask, I've heard the impunity rate can be between 80 and 98%. So given that, it's really difficult for human rights concerns to be mediated, and there are serious repercussions for human rights abuses related to Canadian investments in the region. She goes on to say, she talks about the communications director for the Federation of Agro-Industry Worker Unions of Honduras. He's a labor journalist. He's got a national radio program that's called The Unionist on the Air. He's had that for 19 years, 5 days a week. He recently was working on a union organizing drive, and he was making frequent mention of a local banana supplier. Last June, he started receiving death threats related to his work. Every time he went on the air and spoke about this supplier, he received death threats on his phone, cars circulating his house, and the radio station after his programs. He's now gone into hiding because his family was intimidated. She goes on to say, Hondurans have little faith in the institutions that are set up. Very few investigations are conducted, and the fear that people face is real. Since 2009, 31 trade unionists have been murdered in Honduras and over 33 journalists as well. The 2013 elections, which this government says were fine, this is what was said in committee. The 2013 elections occurred in a difficult human rights context, given the high impunity rate, given the high homicide rate, and there was a report put out that looked at the political killings in Honduras a year and a half prior to the November 2013 elections. And it showed that there were 36 killings in total of candidates and pre-candidates who were set to participate in the November elections. There were 24 armed attacks against these candidates. The list shows that the majority of these killings were against the political opposition party, the Libre Party. This list was published by Rights Action, and a lot of the cases were published by the International Federation of Human Rights, an internationally respected body, worried about the targeted assassinations of the political opposition in the lead-up to the elections. Last year, in the Honduran elections, 36 candidates were murdered in the 18 months prior to that. Does that sound like a democracy? Does that sound like a country that Canadians would want their government extending preferential trade terms to? I want to talk to you about a few other, we heard from PEN, the internationally respected independent organization for journalists. Here's what they said to committee. Our report finds that journalists are targeted for their work, and they are especially vulnerable members of the population. Freedom of expression in Honduras has suffered severe and serious restrictions since the ouster of President Zelaya in 2009. The past 5 years have seen a dramatic erosion in protections for expressive life in Honduras. Journalists are threatened, they're harassed, attacked, and murdered with impunity, and sometimes in circumstances that strongly suggest the involvement of state agents. Now, I've heard some of the people on this side will say, well, it's drug involvement. No, it's not. The evidence is that the state is involved in some of these killings. This has had a devastating impact on the general state of human rights and the rule of law in the country, since violence against journalists often silence coverage of topics such as corruption, organized crime, drug trafficking, and political reportage. Fearing for their personal safety, journalists in Honduras either self-censor or flee the country altogether. I've heard the Minister of Foreign Affairs in this House stand up on the public international stage and rant and rave about the situation in Ukraine, how Canada and the Prime Minister stand up for human rights and democracy in the world stage. And they're a matter of principle. And they'll take that position, doesn't matter what the costs are. And they turn around and sign a trade agreement with Honduras that has about the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere. I hear laughing on the other side of the House. How do we square that? Canada either has a principled position on human rights and democracy, or we do not. In the case of Honduras, this is a contradiction of massive proportions. This is a hypocrisy, and this is opportunistic politics by the Liberals of the highest order. You know, right now we have an election in Ontario where Premier Wynne is going around trying to tell New Democrats that she's progressive. I wonder if the people of Ontario knew that the Liberals in this House were supporting a trade deal with one of the most murderous, anti-democratic, human rights violating jurisdictions on the planet, if they would still view them that way, because they're not progressive. I'll go back to what Penn said. The taint of corruption and the culture of impunity have undermined trust among state agencies and public confidence in key institutions. Public distrust of the police is so great that only about 20% of crime is reported, and of that, less than 4% gets investigated. I've heard Conservatives in this House talk about the lack of reporting of crime in this country. They say crime is underreported, and they say it's a problem in this country. Well, 80% of the crime in Honduras is not even reported because you can't even trust the police officer who comes to your door because they may be on the payroll or they may be involved in the killing. What kind of culture is that? Serious problems are evident throughout the criminal justice system. Police will say an investigation is underway when there is none. The Office of the Special Prosecutor for Human Rights does not have the jurisdiction to try those responsible for the murders of journalists and lacks resources to conduct even the most basic of investigations into human rights abuses. As our report sets out, only 2 convictions have been secured in the 38 journalist killings between 2003 and 2013, an impunity rate of 95%. This is what Penn concluded. To be clear, under international law, when the state is unable or unwilling to prosecute crimes, this is state complicity in human rights violations. Honduras is facing a serious human rights crisis. This is not just a matter of working with Honduras to move beyond a troubled past. Violence against journalists, complete collapse of expressive life, and impunity for violent crimes and human rights abuses are the norm in Honduras. That's what Penn International said. Are these international journalists, are they radicals that we shouldn't pay attention to? Mr. Speaker, we heard from yet other witnesses. Again, it says Honduras is far worse than any of Canada's current trading partners in the region. To give you an idea of the situation in relation to others, in the global press freedom rankings of 191 countries, where Canada ranked 29th, Chile ranked 64th, Peru ranked 89th, and even Colombia, plagued by narco-trafficking, ranked 112. Where did Honduras rank? 140th, tied with Egypt, which has imprisoned 2 Canadian media workers in the past 8 months, and where 32 journalists have been murdered in Honduras since the coup, since 2009. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a bit about mining, because again, the Liberal Party has, they try to convince Canadians that they're concerned about mining standards abroad. So here's the testimony we heard at our committee that was unrebutted, that after 2009, when the Zelaya government was trying to put in a moratorium in place on new mining concessions and to bring in some mining laws, the new regime that was installed at gunpoint by the military got rid of that, and now it leaves the door open to open pit mining. Water sources, except those which have been declared and registered, which are a tiny minority, are not protected. Mining is not prohibited in populated areas, meaning that forced expropriation and displacement of entire communities is taking place. Community consultation is in a theoretical right only after the exploration concession has been granted. Honduras has almost no environmental standards. It has almost no ability to police or regulate its mining. Now again, I expect the member from Scarborough that I mentioned before to stand up in this House and say he's opposed to this deal. If he really cares about mining standards, as he claims he does, then he will stand in this House and say, I can't support this deal with Honduras, where what we're going to do is see environmental degradation, violation of indigenous rights, and pollution and dangerous working conditions come to Honduras. Mr. Speaker, trade deals are about extending preferential terms. The New Democrats believe that we should be extending preferential trade terms to democratic countries, modern democracies that respect human rights, environmental standards, labor standards. We understand many countries are not perfect, but we think that Canadians want those countries to at least be on a positive trajectory in that regard. We think Canadians want to see trade deals signed with countries of strategic value to our country. The testimony from economists at before our committee said that Honduras has almost zero strategic importance to Canada. In fact, they already have virtually zero tariffs in Honduras, so it's going to make zero difference to the amount that we export into Canada. Mr. Speaker, I hope every member in this House who believes in democracy, human rights, and the rule of law stands with the New Democrats and votes against this flawed deal. It's a poor piece of legislation.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have some sincere questions to ask to my honourable colleague. He did a good speech, well researched, but some of the questions I have concerns is, first of all, he talks about trade deals with countries that are favorable to all the things that he attested we should be favorable, such as human rights and so on and so forth. I've been here 10 years. I've yet to see them agree with any free trade deal agreement. I'm sorry, Jordan, thank you. Yes, after that. They didn't stand to vote for that. We're still not sure where they stand on that one. Nevertheless, the nub of the issue is this. If they believe that Honduras is as bad as they claim it is, and I don't doubt there's a lot of human rights violations taking place there, a lot of them, and I agree with them in many respects. What exactly do we do to engage Honduras to improve this situation? Do we shut down dialogue completely? I firmly believe that opening up trade relations has a benefit in many of these countries, a fundamental benefit that we should consider as compassionate people. So I ask him, if there is absolutely no free trade deal agreement, where do we go from here to improve the situation in Honduras?
The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I have great respect for the honourable member, and I take his questions at face value. I mean, the Liberal Party has its own contradictory past. I think they campaigned against the free trade agreement in 1988. I think they actually, in 1993, had a little red book, I think, that said that they were going to renegotiate NAFTA. They never did that. But that's par for the Liberal Party that says one thing at election time and then does another when they're elected. So what is the Liberal Party's record on trade? I'm not sure. The honourable member is a little disingenuous. He knows for a fact that the New Democrats supported the trade deal with Jordan. And whether or not there was a stand vote or whether it was passed by division, he knows is irrelevant as a member of this House. Now, the question of, who should we be engaging with, I think that's a straw man argument. Well, geez, if it's a really terrible country, this is the conservative argument, I'm surprised you're a Liberal making it, well, we should engage with them. If that's the case, we should be signing a free trade agreement with Iran or North Korea. They have terrible human rights. If engaging with those countries is the way to improve human rights, I don't hear anybody in those two parties suggesting that we sign a free trade agreement with those two countries. Why not? It's because of this, Mr. Speaker. When countries are so far outside of the international norm, when they are not conforming to even the basic standards of international behavior, we should not be rewarding those countries. When South Africa had apartheid, we didn't sign a trade agreement with them to facilitate that regime. We brought in sanctions and boycotts. The government, which I'll give them credit for, has done that in Iran. When a country just refuses to comply with basic norms of conduct. Well, that's something. I'll just finish with this, Mr. Speaker. This is what we heard in committee from a professor from York. Trade and investment creates economic benefits, but who ends up with those benefits? In Honduras, the answer seems clear. It is now the country with the most unequal distribution of income in Latin America, and 43% of the labor force is working full-time without receiving the minimum wage. A study by the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington found that 2 years after the 2009 coup, over 100% of the real income gains went to the wealthiest 10% of Honduras. And I'll just stop by saying the de facto regime soon embarked on policies that included using the army and police in actions against citizens exercising their right to protest. Protesters were shot, beaten, and died in open conflict with the military or police. Numerous suspensions of the right to assembly and protest were put in place, all of them out of compliance with international law. That's the country that...
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for British Columbia, Southern Interior.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech and for his work on this file. It's certainly well researched and he understands the issue very clearly. I think the argument we hear from those who support this agreement is that, well, we're a trading nation. Well, we have been a trading nation, and we have traded with all sorts of regimes in our history, many repressive regimes, whether it's China or the former Soviet Union. But I think there is a distinction between trade and free trade. And my colleague mentioned the idea of preferential treatment. In other words, if we sign a free trade agreement, it's a preferential treatment to a country that we want to do business with as opposed to just trading. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit upon this point, because I think it's a bit lost, Mr. Speaker, on the other side.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I wonder if it's lost on the other side or if it's just disingenuously portrayed by the other side, because it's quite obvious. Canada trades with all sorts of nations. We have goods coming to this country right now from China, from Bangladesh, from Vietnam, from Honduras. The only question about trade policy is whether we want to encourage those economic relations with those countries. And trade policy is a tool that is used economically, but it's also a political tool. And again, if that's recognized in this House, this government has imposed trade sanctions on Iran. We're not facilitating trade with Iran. We're actually stopping trade relations with Iran. Now, I want to talk about, pick up a little bit of the thread from my honourable colleague in the Liberal Party and quote Mr. Ricardo Grinspun, who's a York University professor from the Centre for Research on Latin American and Caribbean Studies. He said, "I have argued that the idea that the FTA will bring jobs and assure prosperity to Honduras is not a substantial claim. Indeed, the idea that Canadians can help the most needy people in Honduras through this FTA is a public relations message, nothing more. Moreover, an FTA would provide international legitimacy to a political regime and economic model that is oligarchic, oppressive, and unjust. There are other more effective ways in which Canada could contribute to poverty alleviation, human security, and environmental sustainability in that part of the world, which we could discuss." Back to my honourable colleague's question, those are the kind of measures that we should be extending to Honduras. We should be saying to Honduras, we will work with you to improve your standards, if there's that willingness there in Honduras. But surely we would require that country to demonstrate first a commitment to international norms and standards first, of at least a floor model, before we start extending benefits to them. This government talks about the trade agreements that they've signed. Well, they've signed about 6, and it's all been with countries that are smaller and insignificant: Colombia, Peru, Honduras, Panama, Jordan, the infamous Liechtenstein. Though, you know, who we choose to negotiate with and who we choose to extend preferential terms with on the New Democrat side, we believe should mirror Canadian values. And Canadian values mean we should be trading with countries that at least have a commitment to basic concepts like respecting people's right to assemble in the street, people's rights to vote in elections, people's right to run in elections, having peaceful democratic transition of power, having a functioning judicial system where crime is investigated and prosecuted and punished, where journalists can write with freedom of expression so that the public can actually have a vibrant democratic dialogue. These are basic norms. It's surprising to me that in 2014 I have to stand in this House and defend those. I would have thought every member of this House would agree at once that these are basic concepts that we demand, that Canadians demand should be in place before Canada decides to reward that place. And again, the New Democratic Party will be the only party standing in this House that is going to stand up for those principles, and I hope Canadians are watching.
I think we have enough time for a very brief question comment. Une question très brève. L'honorable député de Saint-Lambert, peut-être 30 secondes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais tenter d'être brève. Il est clair, je remercie mon collègue pour son discours vraiment très éclairant et j'espère que le gouvernement a bien compris le message. Il est évident que les accords de libre-échange sont importants pour notre économie. Mais, Monsieur le Président, nous sommes là tout de même devant un cas d'école. Le Honduras est un pays antidémocratique. Quel message on envoie à la face du monde et comment des peuples, des populations soumises à des dictatures, à des pays donc, antidémocratiques, comment pourrons-nous faire, comment ces peuples-là pourront nous faire confiance dorénavant en ayant comme exemple cet accord de libre-échange?
L'honorable député de Vancouver-Kingsway.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's an excellent question. I mean, I think, Canada's reputation on the world stage depends on our adherence to international norms and our consistency in respecting them. And I think when we do sign a trade agreement with a country that every country in the world knows is not conforming to those standards, like Honduras is not, then it sends a mixed message. And it causes other countries to have less confidence in Canada. And I think it caused them to question what our foreign policy is. If we're going to stand on the world stage and talk about freedom and democracy and human rights, then we've got to walk the walk. We have to be consistent. And the Conservatives and Liberals are not being consistent in this regard on this file, and they should be.